Hi, it's Dr. Crone. In this video, we're going to explore one of the most important concepts in the study of comparative politics, the concept of the state. For those of us who live in the US, our definition of a state might be a subnational geographical unit, like Ohio. But that's not what comparative political scientists mean by a state. A state, in this case, is more like a synonym for a country. It's really important in studying comparative politics that we be able to tell what is a state and what is not. We need a definition. It's not enough just to be able to say, well, Mexico is a state, and Japan is a state, and Brazil is a state, so I know what it must mean. So political scientists try to define what a state is, and it's not easy to define. Some possible definitions that have been given over the years have dealt with sovereignty. So the word sovereign means supreme power or authority or self-governing. So a sovereign political entity is one that is self-governing, where there's a government that has the ultimate power and nothing else from outside of that entity can take power over it. Similarly, the word autonomous is used a lot. Autonomous meaning freedom from external authority. So when we're talking about a state, like the state of Mexico, let's say, what we're talking about is that the Mexican government has the ultimate right to rule Mexico, the accepted right. Other states in the global world recognize its statehood and recognize that Mexico is sovereign and has the right to govern itself. And it's autonomous, meaning that another country cannot overrule it. There isn't any kind of world authority that can overrule that government. So a very famous political scientist and sociologist named Max Weber, he gave a definition that has been long-lasting, which is that a state is an entity that exerts a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a given territory. In other words, if the United States government uses force to, let's say, put down an uprising or something like that within its bounds, it is absolutely within its rights to do that because it is a sovereign political entity. On the other hand, if Canada came into, they sent their army into the United States to, put down an uprising, that would not be a legitimate use of force. Similarly, criminal force, maybe say a criminal gang or something like that, is not a legitimate use of force. So that's a useful, Weber's definition is a useful definition because it helps us to understand what is a state and what is not a state. So we can kind of think about this by applying it to things that we know that have governments, for example. So look at this list and think about it and decide which one of these do you think is a state? And there's more than one on this list. So which one of the things in this list could we consider to be a state? Okay, let's look at that answer. So the highlighted yellow fonts are the ones that are considered to be states. Ohio, we talked about that. Ohio is a subnational unit, and Ohio may have some ability to govern itself. Certainly we have a governor and a legislature, but that can be overruled by the national government. So Ohio doesn't have sovereignty in the way that France, let's say, or Botswana does. Similarly, New York City, a large city, obviously does have a government as well, but they can be overruled both by the state government or by the national government. Other organizations, what we call sort of international organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, also don't function as states because they, while they do unite governments, the United Nations has no sovereignty over countries. All it can really do is suggest bargain, provide an arena for countries to bargain amongst themselves. Its goal is to promote peace across the world. It was actually put into action right after World War II. So that idea that it gives nations a place to come together to bargain with each other, but it doesn't have any sovereignty over countries. The only thing it can do is say you're not allowed to be a member of the United Nations, like a country like North Korea, but that doesn't mean North Korea doesn't have sovereignty in its own area. The European Union similarly is a more tightly organized unit, unifying a bunch of states. But at this point, all of those states that belong to the European Union are sovereign, and we're looking at that right now where Britain, the United Kingdom, is actually exiting the European Union because it doesn't want to be part of it anymore, and the European Union doesn't have the ability to force Britain to stay a part of it. It can make the process difficult, certainly, but it cannot force them to be a part of it. So all states share certain functions, and we have to be important. It's really important to remember that functions are not definitions. Functions are, once we understand, yes, this is a state, we can look at what are the common things that all states do. So all states provide some form of defense. They provide policing. So defense is against an external threat from another country, another state. Policing is internal threats against social order. Taxation, in other words, states, if it's going to be a state, it has to find a way to fund its activities and to maintain order or social control. If you don't have those things, you can't really, a state can't stay stable if it isn't able to do those basic functions. So remember, again, the functions are not definitions. Not everything that does some of these functions is considered a state. A subnational unit like Ohio, we certainly do 3 of the 4 functions. The Ohio government polices Ohio, it taxes Ohio citizens, it maintains order. You could even argue it has defense, although its defense is certainly under the command of the United States Army and the United States chain of command. But just because it does some of these functions doesn't mean that it's a state. It's not completely self-governing. It's not autonomous because the United States government can overrule Ohio. So looking at states, and really Max Weber and other political scientists have spent a lot of time talking about the modern state, which didn't really develop until about the 1700s, early 1800s. You can certainly dive more into those arguments and those ideas if you take a history class or a more higher level political science class about the state. But for now, we'll just assume that when we talk about a modern state, we're talking about the kinds of governments that appeared sometime in the late 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. And Weber talks about the characteristics of a modern state. What makes a modern state? So he says modern states are bureaucratic. In other words, they have government, their functions of government, things like defense and taxation, are carried out by specialized departments that have fixed rules and hierarchical authority. In other words, it's not just the dictator's cousin-in-law who goes around collecting taxes. There's actually a government agency with rules and special functions designed to collect taxes or pay the government's bills or run the military or the police force or something like that. So it's bureaucratic. It's also impersonal, and this is important. A modern state exists independently from any particular leader. North Korea is a state that we know is a dictatorship, and it's very much identified with its dictator at this point, Kim Jong-un. However, if Kim Jong-un was overthrown by a democratic revolution, North Korea would still exist. The idea of North Korea would exist, and North Korea would still be a sovereign government. Transferring power from one leader to another does not take away that state's sovereignty. And then finally, it is sovereign, meaning it is the ultimate authority within their geographical territory. And the government is recognized by the international community. It may not be approved of by the international community. Like I said, it might not be able to be a member of the United Nations if it's not behaving in a way that other states appreciate in the global world. But it is recognized as the sovereign government by at least some of the states in the international community. So these are things that characterize a modern state. What is a modern state? And in some ways they make it different than a pre-modern state like a feudal system or something like that. So I want us to think a little bit about those definitions, and especially the idea of bureaucratic, that a state is bureaucratic. What comes into your mind when you hear the word bureaucracy? Do you think of bureaucracy as a negative or a positive? A lot of people think of bureaucracy like this picture. It's because our interactions with bureaucracy are often negative. If you've ever tried to get your driver's license renewed, especially if there's some problems with your driver's license, or if you've tried to apply for unemployment, or had dealings, let's say, with the court system. All of those are part of the bureaucracy, and I think we have a negative feeling about that because we've often had the negative feelings of this is impersonal, people don't understand me, I have to stand in line. Every time I think I've filled out the forms correctly, it turns out I haven't, I have to redo something. And that can lead to a lot of negativity about the word bureaucracy. So we have to be careful as political scientists not to just bring that negative connotation to our idea about bureaucracy. Because when we think of the modern state and the modern idea of a highly organized state with lots of bureaucratic departments and things like that, we find that really in many ways bureaucracy provides a tremendous benefit to a modern state. If we didn't have a state, for example, we couldn't have systems of roads, we couldn't have policing, we couldn't have things like unemployment, things that are part of our social safety net or the social cushion. We would have anarchy if we didn't have a bureaucratic state to run a large, geographical area with a large population. So I'd like you to think about this, and this is something that you could even post about in your discussion board if you want. What are your thoughts on this topic? Does bureaucracy seem like a negative or a positive to you? What would it be like to live without a state? Maybe some of you think it would be fine to live without a state, or it would be better in some way. So think about that and add your thoughts in the discussion board. Okay, now we'll move on. Now that we kind of have more of an idea of what a state is, let's talk about a very important concept when we look at states, and especially when we compare them with each other, which is the concept of capacity. So capacity is defined as a state's ability to achieve its goals. So in other words, think of what goal a government might have. A government might have the goal of having a strong military, maybe of defending its borders. Maybe a government has a goal of providing a social safety net for people by creating a system of taxation and social welfare. What we're going to look at with capacity is it not so much judging the goals for themselves, whether we think they're good goals or bad goals, but rather looking at, is the state able to do what it wants to do? And we think of capacity as a continuum. So there are states that we would call high capacity states, there are low capacity states, but really it's a long continuum with a vast variety in the middle. And of course, it's one of those things that we can't measure really accurately. But what we would say about a high capacity state are things where, first of all, they have the monopoly on the use of force. So in other words, that state is functioning at a level where it can achieve social order and there are not criminal gangs or rival power centers. There are not uprisings that they have to put down all the time. It's accepted that the states is allowed to use force legitimately, and they're not having questions on that or having to deal with rival powers of force. A properly functioning bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy is efficient and effective and predictable. Doesn't mean we're going to like it, but it means that, for example, if you need to renew your driver's license and you go to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, in a properly functioning bureaucracy, you will have to do the same things that everybody else has to do. You won't have to pay a bribe in order to get your driver's license. It'll be predictable. There's a fee to renew it, and you know what that's going to happen. And even though it may take longer than you want, you can be reasonably sure that when you go and interact with that bureaucracy, it will do what it's supposed to do. So a properly functioning bureaucracy is a sign of high capacity. Maintaining the rule of law. Now that doesn't necessarily mean it's a democracy for sure. Many states with high capacity are not democracies. But what the rule of law means is that there is a law, we know what it is, and we can predict how it's going to be applied. So even if we live in a dictatorship that sets a strict curfew, rule of law would mean that that curfew applies to everybody the same way, and we know what the penalty would be. Even if it's a very bad penalty, we still know what it would be, and that's predictable. So that's what the rule of law is. And then it applies to everyone equally: rich people, poor people, people of different races, different genders, things like that. And then finally, it has to be able to generate adequate revenue. So it has to be able to raise taxes in a way that is meeting its goals, that it can pay for what it wants. That's a high capacity state. So at the other end of that continuum from high capacity states are fragile or weak states. So these are the states that are not coming anywhere close to meeting those basic criteria for capacity. So a fragile or weak state will probably have at least some of these characteristics listed here on this slide: rampant violence and corruption, competing power groups that can't be controlled by the government. For example, maybe the case of Nigeria, which you'll look at in your textbook. Nigeria has several armed gangs where in certain areas they control more of the government than the government actually controls. Those kind of things. In some states, it's organized crime, can't be controlled by the government. There may be rival claims to power. Who's really in charge in this area? Is it the government, or is it this rival group that's this rival uprising? Is it Boko Haram in a terrorist group in Nigeria? Is it the Nigerian rebel forces? At the worst case, of course, you might have a civil war, like what's happening in Syria right now, where we really don't know who's in charge. Often that kind of violence and competition for power is going to go along with high levels of poverty. Said the wrong thing. Crumbling or destroyed infrastructure, those nice states. Those nice roads that we looked at a picture of before are not working well. They're falling apart. The state can't fix them. They can't do what's necessary to take care of things. And often the government is captive in some way to criminals or business leaders or like a certain dominant religious group or something, where the government is not adhering to the rule of law, but it's really making laws that are only beneficial to one small group in the society. These are all characteristics of a fragile, or what's called a weak state. If you're interested in looking at that more, I have some examples here: Somalia, Yemen, and South Sudan. There's also a website where you can look at every state in the across the globe and see how it's rated, whether it's rated as a fragile state or not. If you just Google the word Fragile States Index, you can check that out and see what you're most interested in there in terms of which countries look like they are fragile states. And that would be a great thing to post on the discussion board if you find anything out neat about that. Remember that you will be reading a case study of a low capacity state from your textbook. So in that case study section on Nigeria, try finding things that you might want to share for the discussion board about that case. The case study is trying to look at whether Nigeria, which is a weak state, can be changed or not, and sort of what's the hope for the future for Nigeria, and what would have to change if it was going to become a higher capacity state than it is right now. So hopefully that'll give you some food for the discussion board as well. So that's the end of this video. There is going to be a second video for this unit, so be sure that you look at that and read the assigned readings before posting to the discussion board. I've given you some ideas on things you can discuss. Certainly you do not have to discuss all of them. Those are ideas, things that you might want to add to the discussion, but you don't have to feel like you have to respond to all of those. All right, well, I hope that you have a good week this week exploring the concept of the state, and I'll see you again in our second video.